2500 jaar geleden schreef een wijze Griek over een lijst met legendarische wereldwonderen. Wat je in je geest ziet, kan nooit verloren gaan. Het mysterie van deze wonderen werkt nog steeds door tot in onze tijd.
This is the story of some of the West's most basic ideas. Ideas of God and paradise and womanhood, and how they crossed from the most ancient East into the modern world. The tale's 10,000 years old and more, and you could start by telling it anywhere, really. We'll begin here, though, in Rome, on the 5th of May, 1527, with a frightened pope fleeing from a German army, running like mad along the top of this fortified wall that stretches between the Vatican and the ancient castle of St. Michael. There was a great siege. In the end, the Pope lost everything. His gold, his jewels, his very clothes were taken from him. Within 10 years, though, another Pope was back in the same old castle, reasserting the holy power and grand authority of Rome.
That text there tells the story. It tells of how the Pope found a ruin, an ancient tomb, and made it into a great palace fit for a prince. And there, right in the middle, on the end wall, St. Michael, the god of judgment, with a dripping sword. You've got to think that this was a Pope who knew that the papal crowns had been melted down in this very fortress just a few years earlier. He was the Pope who started the Inquisition. But he also wanted to be known as a Christian knight, a gentleman, a man of action. So he cast around for an idea for his paintings, and he hit upon Alexander the Great. He had the same name as the Pope. Here he is, one of Alexander's greatest deeds, cutting the Gordian knot. There was a legend that said that in the East was a knot that was so entangled, the man who could undo it would become king of the world. Alexander took a look and cut it with his sword. The chivalrous knight as a man of action. And there, the chivalrous knight, Alexander, really as the patron of the arts. You see the book down the bottom? That's the complete works of Homer. Alexander is ordering that it be rebound. And over there, well, that is Alexander the chivalrous knight. That woman who's so beseeching him is the wife of the king of Persia. And Alexander's saying, no, I won't take you, I won't rape you as normal kings do. I'm a chivalrous man. He did, however, take the Persian gold back to the West. So Alexander here is operating as a bridge. Didn't just take gold. Think of all the things that came out of the mystic East. Silk, apricots, cherries, flowers, gardens, palaces that nobody had dreamt of, and gardens that were wonders. Alexander's empire was an empire of wonders. He conquered the city that had the ancient Eastern statue of the mother goddess in it. He died in Babylon, the city of the hanging gardens. This then is our story of these amazing wonders from the East and how this single man was the first bridge between the two. The legend of Alexander had started when he died in Babylon in 323 BC.
At first it was a hero cult, run by his generals who were ruling his enormous empire. Here's the legend of the chivalrous knight at its very beginning then. A painting of young Alexander fighting the Persians, opening up the ancient East. Actually, this is a Roman mosaic from Pompeii, a clever copy of an original probably made at the time of Alexander and painted by a woman. Some people think that it was commissioned by this man, standing next to Alexander. Certainly it's a real portrait, as is the face of Alexander himself.
The whole thing's pure propaganda, really. It's the usual mix of myth and incredibly accurate historical detail. It's also a very good picture of a battle. See those spears at the back? They're the Greek spears, these terrifying 17-foot spears, and they're about to be lowered, and the Greek army is going to advance on the Persian line, which is very long and thin. Meanwhile, Alexander is cutting down the inside of the line to arrive at the king of Persia in the middle of his army. Poor old Darius there. Look at Alexander. He's already speared one of Darius's bodyguards. They're called the Immortals, but his eye is fixed on the king of Persia. You could say it's this terrifying collision in time. It's happened again and again with the Spanish in South America. It's happening in our own time. When two societies, two cultures collide and one disintegrates. Look, there's Darius's charioteer. He's off, he's finished, they're done for. It's the New World destroying the old agrarian society of the ancient East. But look at the detail in the artist. Look at the harnesses of the Persians and the Greeks. Look at the spears and the helmets. All incredible detail. What this Greek artist is doing is inventing the idea of a barbarian, of an effete Eastern person. And in so doing, of course, he's inventing his own identity. And that identity is still a part of the West's identity today. And it's a part in which the Seven Wonders has an important role.
In Egypt, by the Nile, they called Alexander Pharaoh. By the waters of Babylon, he ruled from the great old palace of King Nebuchadnezzar. And here he died. The air was filled with mist, and a great star was seen descending from the sky, and Alexander fell into his eternal sleep. So runs the legend. He had died at the very heart of the ancient East. Babylon, built by the gods, the city of 1,000 dreaming spires, the city of the Tower of Babel and the exile of the Jews. Babylon of Belshazzar and his wicked feast. The city, too, of the mysterious, elusive hanging gardens, which, so the Greeks who wrote upon the wonders tell us, were the gardens of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and fields so high that ploughmen passed above your head, and great high trees whose hanging roots were watered by the misty spray of playing fountains. Archaeologists dug into the gentle mounds of Babylon before the First World War. It was a large and well-conducted expedition, led by the respected Berlin professor Robert Koldewey. They dug out the city's buried walls, once counted as a wonder of the world in their own right. They found the very gates through which the captive kings of Judah had passed with all their courtiers. They found 25,000 inscribed clay tablets, measured Nebuchadnezzar's ruined city, and brought old Babylon back to life again. And so, the ancient ruins of Babylon have been built again. The new bricks stamped not with the names of ancient kings, but with the name of Saddam Hussein, Babylon's most recent ruler. Koldewey, then, found many treasures. He also thought that he had found the Hanging Gardens. They stood here, he wrote, amongst this dust, on these stone arches. And he made some clever drawings to show how they had looked. And yet, he had really found nothing of the sort. tree roots of these hanging gardens would have forced the bricks and stones apart. 3 centuries on, Alexander would have looked down upon a dreadful ruin. Translations of those ancient tablets, too, showed that Kolduvai's hanging gardens had really been offices of government, that the big arches hadn't held a hanging garden, but were humble storerooms underneath a road. These same Babylonian texts also provided a mystery of their own. Not one of them so much as even mentioned hanging gardens. What on earth, then, was this wonder of the world? Well, most of the Greeks who wrote about the hanging gardens had never been to Babylon. They knew, though, of the wondrous gardens of the East, the gardens that the Persian kings called paradise. And so they simply seem to have put the two together and made for us a dream of gardens far away in distant Babylon, the grandest, most exotic things in all the Orient. What was it, though, that had inspired this special vision of a garden hanging in the air? The answer is the humble farms of ancient Greece, where hanging fields, or more properly translated terraced fields, strips of land on hillsides, was a usual way of growing crops.
Olives and wheat and lovely wine and lots of good cheese from sheep and goats. It's the classic Mediterranean diet. And it was invented, or at least developed, in ancient Greece from about 1000 BC. And that protein-rich diet actually became the powerhouse that fueled the great flowering of Greek culture. It was a completely new sort of diet. The older civilizations had been by rivers, with rich silt beside them, lots of lovely water, and a tremendous diversity of crops. There's none of that in Greece, of course. It was hard land, hard soil. And although the takings were good, it wasn't a very diverse existence. So the Greeks were tough people. You think of Plato, the great thinker, in his academy surrounded by his students. That academy was a dry olive grove outside Athens, exactly like this one. So when these brave, tough guys went to the east, they were absolutely astonished by what they saw. They were astonished by the softness of the landscape and by the richness of the crops, by the apricots and cherries that were growing that you could just pick off the trees, and by the incredible richness of the people themselves too. And when they returned to Greece, they carried this extraordinary dream of paradise, which after all is only the Persian word for garden, straight back into the West, and it's remained there ever since. Alexander the Great had read about the gardens of paradise in his beloved Homer even when he was a child. He probably read the accounts of mercenaries too, working at the Persian court. These rough old soldiers had been amazed at the sophistication of King Cyrus, and King Cyrus had been delighted with them. He said, all this I'd planted out and measured with my own hands. Some of the trees I'd even planted myself. The Romans brought the idea of paradise from Greece, that great memory, into the heart of Rome. And this garden here is a Renaissance garden designed from a drawing of an ancient Roman garden made by the architect Piero Ligurio. And of course, it still has the cross streams of paradise in it. The streams of paradise you'll find in the book of Genesis, in the great Mesopotamian myths. Gilgamesh, the hero, found the elixir of life in a paradise like this. In places like this, then, in the gardens of Cardinal Gambra, Bagnaia, the north of Rome, you not only find beauty and peace, but you find shapes and scents that take you back right through history back to your very beginnings.
The Greeks said that the hanging gardens were built to please a homesick Persian concubine, an imitation of the mountains of her homeland on the flat plain of Iraq. It is filled with all sorts of trees and looks exactly like a mountain country. The several parts of it rise one on another and resemble a theatre. It is thickly planted, and the trees' broad leaves nearly touch each other and make delightful shade. Waters gush forth from high fountains, sink down into the ground, and are forced up again in twists and spirals, rushing and swirling through the pipes. Bountiful moisture bathes the tree roots, and the soil is perpetually moist. Such was the dream of paradise, the dream of Philo of Byzantium in the 3rd century before Christ. Follow these ancient streams back to their beginnings. Go, as Alexander did, back to the font of our experience, and you'll find not only paradise, but the most ancient gods as well. Just as they stand here in the gardens of the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, close by Rome, so they stand deep in our minds, back at our beginnings. All along Alexander's route through Asia were the temples of the most ancient gods, gods whose Greek names Alexander knew and worshipped, but gods that when he saw them in other costumes and in other countries, he recognized as part of a common well of sacredness. This marvelous rock shrine is called Yassilikaya in central Turkey. It is the most sacred sanctuary of the ancient Hittites and other races too who came here after them. Most of their gods they brought with them from Central Asia. These reliefs are now some 3,000 years old, and they've never been attacked. They still hold their ancient sacredness.
We're right at the heart of the shrine. And that god there, that's the god Teshub, the god who in Greece becomes Zeus, who when he rolls his black curls causes thunder and thunderbolts to hit the ground. That one there, the small god with the double-headed axe, that becomes the Greek god Apollo. But it's the lady in the middle, that much-travelled lady. It's really our interest here. It's really a large part of the history of world religion too. 800 years after she's carved on this wall, she's found in India as the god Varuna. See, she's standing on a panther. She started standing on a panther 2,000 years before this scene was made in ancient Sumer. And 7,000 years before that, the villagers of Anatolia were painting her on the walls of their shrines. She is what is known as the great goddess, the mother goddess. In Alexander's day, the people of Asia called her Cybele. The Greeks called her Artemis, and her temple at Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the world.
Great is Diana of the Ephesians. The acoustics here are incredible, aren't they? Can you imagine what it must have been like with 40,000 people roaring those words down through the city streets and out across the sea? That's what the book of Acts said happened here in 53 AD when St. Paul brought Christianity to the great city of Ephesus. Diana is the Bible's name for Artemis. This was the city of Artemis. She decorated every temple, every building. She was the richness of the city and she was the pride of its inhabitants. And you can't be surprised that 40,000 of them were roaring their defiance at Christianity. She, of course, had been in the city for 1,000 years. And it would take St. Paul and his followers another 300 to dislodge her cult. 1,800 years later, a single Englishman sat in this same theatre. He was looking out across the landscape, looking for any trace he could see of the great temple of Artemis. The Englishman's name was John Turtle Wood. He was a wealthy amateur traveller, an archaeologist, and in the way of those people in the 19th century, he was quietly obsessed. He was obsessed with finding one of the 7 wonders of the world, this great temple which had completely disappeared. Wood stayed in Ephesus for year after year, digging for that temple. He went through a fortune. He caught malaria. He was threatened with kidnapping. He was shot at. He broke God knows how many bones in his body, but he found the temple in the end. And it was here in the theatre that he found the first clue. Wood's great clue was on this wall. Now, when he was digging here, all of this wall was covered with dirt, which had swept down from the mountains over the theatre. When Wood cleared it away, he found a whole lot of inscriptions on it. Now, that's not surprising because there are lots of inscriptions. Ephesus is covered in them. But this one was rather interesting. It had been written about 50 years after St. Paul's visit to Ephesus by a citizen of the place called Caius Vibius Salutarius. And it stood here. It was such a remarkable inscription, in fact, that Wood got a British Navy boat, the HMS Terrible, to come in, dock close by. 15 Jolly Jack tars came along with ropes and hacksaws and removed the whole thing. In fact, they got a pound of tobacco for getting it away unbroken. Now, what this said was that this man, C. Vibius Salutarius, who lived about 50 years after St. Paul, donated a whole lot of golden statues of Artemis to the great temple. Now, that was interesting in itself, but what was crucial for Wood was that it described a procession that these statues took every year on Artemis's birthday. It said the statues were brought from the temple to the gate of the city, the Magnesian Gate, and there they were met by the young men in the city and carried down in procession. So what Wood had to do now was to find this Magnesian Gate, and then he would have the road to the temple.
Using the inscriptions as his guide, Wood dug down into the ancient city, down along its streets, back into Alexander's world. Ephesus had been one of the richest, most modern cities on the planet. As Wood dug along its marble streets, he dug back into ancient life. Here, you might see sailors from India and Rome and Alexandria. Persians, too, with purple robes, all sewn with golden beads. Corinthians in crimson, violet and sea green. And the busy priests of Artemis in lozenge-patterned gowns with bees all drawn upon them. As he dug his way up the great marble street, though, Wood missed the town statue of the goddess Artemis. Years later, Austrian archaeologists found her in the back of the town hall, cushioned in fine sand, buried by some early Christians who could not bear to see the goddess leave their city. For 17 centuries she had laid there in the dark, garlanded with sculpted necklaces and fine robes, hung about with those mysterious breast-like objects that had become her major symbol.
Within a year of finding the inscription, Wood had found a city gate. He knew it was the gate to Magnesia because the city of Magnesia was just over there. And right in front of it, the great broad pavement he knew would lead him to the Temple of Artemis. Once again, John Turtle Wood had come down on an amazing piece of history. This was the gate that one of the pseudo-gospels said St. John walked through to convert the Ephesians. And when he came, there was a gilded statue of the goddess standing there with a veil over her face, a lamp at her feet. John says the city was dark from the smoke of the goddess's altars. He put pay to that. The gate, by the 2nd century, had become Christian. The city converted by John. Anyway, Wood had more immediate problems. When he got to the outside of the gate, he was on a pavement, sure, but which way did he go? He dug a fan 150 feet into the landscape, 12 feet deep, looking for the road. He was lucky. He didn't find one road, he found two. Now he had a problem. Should he go left or should he go right across the landscape? Well, this is how he solved it. These deep channels here are the ruts from the carriages as they went through the city. One of these roads, the one leading to the right, had hardly any ruts. The road that took all the city traffic went left, and so did Wood.
Wood's Walk looks much the same today. There's a little country track, though, where once there was an ancient highway. Imagine hundreds of men cutting the landscape, all digging away. Greek and Armenian workmen, with bright-dressed Turkish soldiers looking on, and bandits peering at them from the hills.
Wood found hundreds of these on his way down the road. He wasn't looking for them much. They're sarcophagi, and they're filled with whole families of people.
Here's one of their epitaphs. Hiero's nurse, who loved wine, lies here. May her old body buried amid the vines feed in death the vats she loved in life.
"5 years into his work, Wood was in real trouble. He had malaria badly and he was running out of money. The only thing he had to go on was that an ancient guidebook said the road to the temple went slightly downhill, and Wood felt that this track was going slightly downhill. It didn't seem to be going anywhere, really. So he took a big chance. The very last cash he had, he stopped digging, moved the men 1/3 of a mile on where he thought the road might be, and dug another hole. 12 feet down, he found these. They might not look much, but to Wood they were manna from heaven. These, he knew, were the base of a great colonnade that a rich man had built, so the statue of the goddess could come down her sacred way to the temple without getting rained on. Wood not only found the colonnade, he even found the roof tiles that kept the goddess dry.
He must have longed for a sight of the temple, though. The temple built, so legend said, by rich King Croesus, burnt down by a madman on the day that Alexander had been born, and built again more grand and richer than before.
Though Wood was still following those big square stones, he felt himself in real trouble once he'd left the hills behind him. You see, all he could see was a little Turkish town. As he himself said, I felt the pangs of failure come across me as I looked across the broad, uninterrupted plain without a trace of a mound that could hide the great temple. The farmers, of course, wouldn't dig in the fields at all. So he had to try working in the corners, on the roads and places like this. And there, as luck would have it, he found more of his square stones. He was a clever man. He noticed that they still followed the lines of the fields, and that line led straight to the old Turkish fort. In the last months of 1869, John Wood broke his foot. So, for the work to continue, his wife had to come with him. Previously, she stayed home and cooked. Now she was down the trench and he was stuck up top on a horse. It was, said Wood, the most fortunate accident he'd ever had. From that moment on, they always worked together.
Mrs. Wood took over the excavations, supervising holes 25 feet deep and finding altars, statues and mosaic pavements, but never the Temple of Artemis. Then, on the very last day of the year, at a depth of 25 feet, the workmen hit huge blocks, a great marble pavement. By the 3rd of January, the Woods knew that they had found the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Delirious from exhilaration and malaria, John Wood sat down to write his journal. In his enthusiasm, he wrote solidly for 15 hours and collapsed. So ended the most romantic archaeological search ever mounted. When today you walk through the site of Wood's great excavation, across the ruin field where once there stood a vast and holy temple, it's difficult to see what all the fuss had been about.
What had fired John Wood for those 7 long years in the search for these few blocks of stone was the temple's sheer fame. It's mentioned thousands and thousands of times in the ancient references. Gibbon, that greatest of historians, describes it as a combination, a conspiracy, he says, of the arts of Greece and the wealth of Asia, enriched by successive kings and renowned for its piety.
Here had stood one of the holiest shrines of Alexander's world. Even the fish that ran in the river beside the temple were considered holy. Imitations of the building were built in other lands. Silver models of the goddess were sold by the thousand. Like a great cathedral, the real wonder here was holiness itself.
The Christians finally killed the goddess Artemis. The great statue at the center of the town of that deceitful demon, they called her, was taken down and the victorious cross of Christ was erected in her place. By the 4th century, all mention of Artemis's name was scratched from the inscriptions of the town.
So what had the great Temple of Artemis actually looked like? Like this one, at Didyma, on the same coast of southern Turkey, where the surviving detail is superb. Some of the architects that worked here also worked on the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. It's Greek architecture at its grandest, perfect for that stately lady, the oldest goddess in the world. Clean, clear and straight, sumptuous and majestic. And standing here still, for our very great delight. Today, the stones of the great Temple of Artemis are scattered through the little town that stands by ancient Ephesus.
Every one of the stones in this aqueduct once came from somewhere else. So, a little bit of a Roman temple up there. You see that very pretty little bit of moulding once stood on the entablature above a column. But it's small and a little wibbly-wobbly, so it certainly didn't come from the Artemisium. But this block down here, is something very different. Of course, its sheer size gives it away. It's the same elements that the Romans used, but it's very much bigger here. It has a grandness about it that immediately catches your eye. These tatty fragments here, you see, are called astragals. They were once great egg shapes. And how well carved it is, too. Just look at that. It's made as finely as something would be on a machine, but with such delicacy, such style, such grandness. That truly is a tiny fraction of one of the 7 wonders of the world. And there are other bits here, too. Now, this bit here, this is a real find. You see, when they built it into the aqueduct, the masons cut down the edge of the stone to get a nice crisp edge here, but they left this bit in the middle. And this shows this lovely, clean, grand carving that's really so typical of the Temple of Artemis. In fact, it's a small piece of one of the 127 columns that the Roman Pliny said that building had.
See how it works? The flutes on the column, those grooves in the stone, can tell you just how high it was. With bits like that, then, you can almost reconstruct the temple. There were, though, 3 different styles of temple, the 3 orders of Greek architecture. Doric was the strongest, Corinthian the most decorative. Wood discovered that the Artemis temple had been Ionic, with its gentle scrolls. When Pliny visited it, he said the temple was 225 feet wide and 425 feet long. With its great forest of 127 columns, the shrine of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world, would have looked like this. What does archaeology say, though, down at the excavations? Well, amazing stuff. Professor Bammer at the University of Vienna has been rewriting the history of the great goddess. All around these ancient temples, sealed in the river silt, were the jewels of the goddess from the innermost parts of her shrine, her clothes and treasures, and the presents that people brought to her. The ground was seeded with a residue of faith. A mixture of faith, too, from Asia, Africa, and Europe, all here at the shrine of the Mother Goddess. She's quite heavy. Solid gold. One of a round dozen of goddesses found in the treasures around the temple. Look at that face. That face was staring in temples 3,000 years before Christ in ancient Mesopotamia. And here she is again at Ephesus, the Lady Goddess. They weren't just these little statues. They were the actual clothing that Artemis herself wore in her temple. The great belts that you see on the statues. There were 2 of those and fragments of more, exactly the same as you see in stone. And all the jewellery, too, lay stuck between the silt as it lay for thousands of years. Look, these are the goddesses' necklaces. Crystal, amber from the Baltic, glass from Phoenicia. These hung around her necks in great swathes. Then there was the actual pieces of necklace itself, with the beads of the goddess. The beautiful bull's head, that was a central piece, strung round in a circle. And then to go on that great shawl that you see on the statues too, these beautiful lion-headed brooches, and lots of rosettes too. See the little holes for sewing them onto the robes? But one of the most interesting things seems to have been the solution to the great puzzle of what those breast objects were on the goddess.
Now it seems, looking at these little amber beads here, that they're actually fruits. See this beautiful little piece of Baltic amber? That little top there is just like a baby pomegranate, like a little jewel in itself. And this, perhaps an aubergine. Perhaps the goddess was covered in an abundance of fruit. The goddess Artemis hadn't just left her jewelry behind in her temples, but thousands and thousands of examples of the gifts she'd been given from every country in the ancient East. Artemis had this magnetism which gave you presents from Egypt. That little chap has jumped here all the way from Egypt. It's Bess, the god of childbirth, who bangs a tambourine and makes everybody very happy. And from Egypt too, lucky scarabs, wishing you health, prosperity, and a long life. From Phoenicia, the Phoenicians have left us, the sanctuary of the great goddess, some of their finest ivory carvings. The sort of thing you read about in the Bibles. The biblical kings lived in rooms decorated by these same artists. And from Central Asia, those mysterious mobile cultures, they're called the animal style, but look at these, the beautiful griffin, the bronzes, all these strange markings of civilizations we hardly know about, yet who worshipped at the shrines of Artemis. And from Greece herself, Professor Bammer has excavated some of the very finest archaic ivories yet seen.
This, then, is the Greek face of a much more ancient lady. Alexander called her Artemis, the Anatolians Cybele. The Romans knew her as Diana, the virgin goddess of the hunt. And she came into Europe with the ancient Babylonian zodiac, the bats of hell, and all the wisdom and compassion of a great all-knowing mother. Within a century of the expulsion of the goddess Artemis from Ephesus, Eastern Gospels tell us that the city had been the final earthly refuge of the Virgin Mary, and Ephesus became the most important Christian city of the great province of Roman Asia.
And in 431, here in this very church, it hosted a council, a supreme council of the Christian church. And that really was to debate the most fundamental issue any religion ever has to decide, the nature of Godhead itself. Here it was. The Christian church adopted the notion of the Holy Trinity. That is, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. So where in this extraordinary theological setup did Mary, the mother of Jesus, figure? Well, she was clearly the mother of God, and so she was voted at this church council, Theotokos, God-bearer. That's a beautiful thing when you think about it. Here in the city of Artemis, with her temple that was one of the 7 wonders of the world, with ideas of female deity that stretched back for 10 millennia before the Christian church ever existed. Here in this same city, the notion of female deity has gone full circle and swum back into modern faith.
That, then, is the story of a temple and a garden, of the jewels of a virgin goddess and a dream of paradise. And of Alexander, too, that noble knight whose fabled journey through the distant East brought the West some of the 7 wonders of the world.
Het laatste wereldwonder staat in Egypte. In die laatste aflevering ook aandacht voor de moderne wereldwonderen. Volgende week zondag, dan om 11 uur. En heeft u teletext, kijk dan op pagina 346 voor extra informatie bij deze serie. 7 wereldwonderen worden beschreven aan de hand van oude geschriften en archeologische vondsten. Het boek kost 49,75 en is verkrijgbaar bij de boekhandel. Bestellen kan ook. Maak dan 49,75 over op Giro 54 42 32 van TELEAC in Utrecht. Of bel ons tijdens kantooruren 030 946 946.